The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Marion County Courthouse, its rays highlighting the dust particles floating in the air of the aged building. Dr. Sarah Bennett rushed through the heavy wooden doors, her comfortable sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floor. She was running a few minutes late, having come directly from her laboratory where an important experiment had demanded her attention longer than expected. Her dark curly hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore what she considered her lab casual attire: clean jeans, a comfortable sweater, and her favorite white running shoes. A small coffee stain marked the sleeve of her sweater, evidence of her hurried morning. The security guard at the entrance gave her a cursory glance, his eyes lingering a moment too long on her casual appearance. "Courtroom 3B, he said, his tone carrying a hint of judgment. "Better hurry up. Judge Andrews doesn't like tardiness." Sarah nodded politely, clutching her worn leather bag closer as she hurried down the corridor. Her heart raced slightly, not from nervousness about the minor traffic violation she was there to address, but from the thought of the cell cultures she'd had to leave mid-experiment. Her research assistant had promised to monitor them, but Sarah couldn't help worrying about the potential results of her latest cancer treatment trial. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Judge Michael Andrews sat elevated behind his massive oak desk, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an appearance of distinguished authority. His black robe seemed freshly pressed, and his posture was perfectly straight, almost rigid. He was known throughout the county for his strict adherence to protocol and his sometimes harsh sentencing, even for minor infractions. As Sarah quietly made her way to an empty bench, she could feel the weight of several pairs of eyes following her movement. The courthouse regulars, clerks, attorneys, and bailiffs had a way of sizing up newcomers, placing them into neat categories in their minds. Sarah was used to this kind of scrutiny. It came with being one of the few black women in her field of biomedical research. "Next case," Judge Andrews called out, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Sarah Bennett, traffic violation, Section 23A. Sarah stood up, smoothing her jeans with slightly sweaty palms. As she walked to the defendant's position, she could see Judge Andrews' eyes narrow slightly, taking in her casual appearance. His mouth tightened into a thin line as he glanced down at her file. "Miss Bennett," he began, emphasizing the "Ms." in a way that made it sound almost like a criticism, "you were caught driving 45 miles per hour in a 30-mile zone near Harrison Elementary School. Do you realize the danger you pose to those children?" Before Sarah could explain that the incident had occurred at 7 p.m., long after school hours, Judge Andrews continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I see this kind of reckless behavior all too often," he said, looking down at her over his glasses. "People who think they're above the law, who don't consider the consequences of their actions. Tell me, Ms. Bennett, what do you do for a living?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions. Judge Andrews had already formed his opinion. Sarah could see it in the way he held himself, in the slight curl of his lip, in the expectant looks on the faces of the court staff. They had all seen this scene play out before. A stern lecture, a heavy fine, perhaps even a mandatory traffic safety course. Sarah stood straight, her 5 feet 6 inches, somehow seeming taller as she gathered herself to respond. The simple question about her occupation was about to shatter their preconceptions, but for now, the weight of their judgment pressed against her like a physical force. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the particles of dust that danced in the air, frozen in this moment before everything changed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Judge Andrews shuffled through the papers on his desk, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. The courthouse clock ticked loudly in the tense silence, its sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Sarah remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her, maintaining her composure despite the judge's dismissive attitude. "Well?" Judge Andrews prompted impatiently, looking up from his papers. "I asked you about your occupation, Miss Bennett. Surely that's not a difficult question to answer." His tone carried the weight of 20 years on the bench, years spent dealing with what he considered to be endless excuses and sob stories. Several people in the gallery leaned forward slightly, curious about the exchange unfolding before them. The court clerk had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she waited for Sarah's response. The bailiff, who had seen thousands of cases come through this courtroom, raised an eyebrow at the unusual tension in the air. "Before I answer that, Your Honor," Sarah began carefully, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to point out that the incident occurred at 7 p.m., well after school hours. There were no children present at the time." Judge Andrews' face reddened slightly at her correction. He was not used to defendants speaking up for themselves, especially not with such quiet confidence. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice rising, "the speed limit is not a suggestion that expires when school lets out. The law is the law." He picked up a pen and began writing on a notepad, speaking as he wrote. "Given your apparent attitude and lack of remorse, I'm inclined to impose the maximum fine. Perhaps that will help you understand the seriousness of your actions." He looked up at her again, his eyes cold. "I assume you'll need time to arrange payment." The assumption hung heavy in the air, its implications clear to everyone in the courtroom. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times throughout her career when people underestimated her based on her appearance. The young public defender sitting at the nearby table winced visibly at the judge's tone. He had seen this pattern before, but something about this particular defendant seemed different. The way she carried herself, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the subtle confidence in her posture, it all suggested there was more to her story than the judge was assuming. "Your Honor?" Sarah spoke again, her voice remaining respectful but firm. "I understand the seriousness of the violation. However, I think there's been a misunderstanding about—" "Miss Bennett," Judge Andrews interrupted, raising his hand to silence her, "I've heard every excuse imaginable in this courtroom. Unless you have something substantial to add about your means to pay the fine, I suggest you save both our time." The morning had grown warmer, and a bead of sweat rolled down Sarah's temple. She thought about her laboratory waiting for her, about the groundbreaking research her team was conducting, about the lives their work could save. She thought about all the times she had to prove herself, all the moments she had to rise above prejudice and preconceptions. The court clerk had resumed typing, recording every word of this exchange for the official record. The rhythmic clicking of her keyboard provided a soundtrack to the mounting tension. Several attorneys waiting for their cases to be called had stopped reviewing their papers, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. Judge Andrews picked up his gavel, clearly ready to move on to the next case. "Given your appearance and attitude, Ms. Bennett, I'll give you 60 days to pay the fine in installments. Consider this leniency on the court's part." He began to raise the gavel, prepared to make his judgment official. Sarah took a deep breath. The moment had come to reveal who she really was, and she knew from experience that what she was about to say would change the entire dynamics of the courtroom. Just as Judge Andrews' gavel began its descent, Sarah's voice cut through the air with quiet authority. "Your Honor, I'm Dr. Sarah Bennett, Senior Research Director at the Marshall Institute for Biomedical Research. I lead a team of 12 scientists working on breakthrough cancer treatments." The gavel stopped midair. The courtroom fell so silent that the gentle whirring of the air conditioning seemed thunderous. Judge Andrews' hand remained frozen, his knuckles whitening around the wooden handle as he processed what he'd just heard. "I apologize for my casual appearance," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "I came directly from my laboratory, where we're conducting time-sensitive experiments on a new treatment for aggressive breast cancer. My team is currently monitoring cell cultures that could potentially save thousands of lives." The court clerk's fingers hovered motionless over her keyboard. The bailiff, who had been leaning against the wall, straightened his posture. The attorneys waiting for their cases exchanged glances, their briefcases forgotten in their laps. Judge Andrews slowly lowered his gavel, removing his glasses with his other hand. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at the woman standing before him. The coffee stain on her sleeve no longer seemed like a sign of carelessness, but rather evidence of a rushed morning in a laboratory. Her casual clothes weren't a show of disrespect for the court, but the practical attire of someone whose mind was occupied with matters far more significant than appearance. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice notably different from his earlier tone, "could you please elaborate on your work?" Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional composure. "Our team has recently developed a promising targeted therapy that could reduce the mortality rate of triple-negative breast cancer by up to 60%. We're in the final stages of our preclinical trials, and the results have been remarkable." She reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out her identification badge from the Marshall Institute. The photograph showed her in a lab coat, standing before an impressive array of scientific equipment. I have 3 patents pending for our treatment methods, and our research has been published in leading medical journals. A young law clerk who had been organizing files in the corner stopped what she was doing, staring at Sarah with undisguised admiration. The public defender smiled slightly, enjoying the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Judge Andrews cleared his throat, clearly struggling to reconcile his earlier assumptions with the accomplished professional standing before him. Dr. Bennett, he paused, searching for words. Your work sounds incredibly important. It is, Your Honor, Sarah replied quietly. Every minute counts in our research. That evening, I was rushing back to the lab after a crucial meeting with our funding committee. I acknowledge my speed violation and take full responsibility for it. I'm prepared to pay the fine immediately. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out her checkbook. The simple action seemed to carry extra weight now, challenging every assumption that had been made about her ability to pay. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the courtroom. The same dust particles that had danced in the air earlier now seemed to hang suspended, as if they too were waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Judge Andrews set his gavel down completely, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on his desk. The stern mask he usually wore had cracked, revealing something that looked remarkably like shame underneath. Dr. Bennett, he began again, his voice carrying a new note of respect, I believe I owe you an apology. I made assumptions that were, he paused, choosing his words carefully, completely unfounded and unprofessional. The entire courtroom held its breath, witnessing something rarely seen in these halls, a judge acknowledging his own prejudice. Sarah stood tall, her presence now commanding the room not through any deliberate effort on her part, but through the sheer weight of her accomplishments and dignity. Judge Andrews sat back in his chair, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of his realization. The morning's court schedule lay forgotten on his desk as he listened to Dr. Bennett explain more about her research, each word further dismantling his prejudiced assumptions. Last month, our team published our findings in the Journal of Medical Research, Sarah explained, her eyes lighting up as she spoke about her work. We've discovered a new pathway to target cancer cells that could revolutionize treatment protocols. The National Institute of Health has expressed interest in fast-tracking our clinical trials. The judge's fingers drummed nervously on his desk, a habit he hadn't displayed in years. Through his 30 years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and just. Now, in the harsh light of his own biased behavior, that self-image was crumbling. A young intern from the district attorney's office had slipped into the courtroom during Sarah's explanation and now stood transfixed by the door. She pulled out her phone, discreetly searching for Dr. Bennett's published works. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the impressive list of accomplishments. Dr. Bennett, Judge Andrews spoke, his voice carrying a hint of genuine curiosity. Could you tell us more about the potential impact of your research? I imagine the implications are significant. Sarah nodded, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the dramatic shift in the judge's attitude. Our preliminary results suggest a 72% reduction in tumor size using our new treatment method. For context, current treatments average around 30% reduction. More importantly, we're seeing minimal side effects compared to traditional chemotherapy. The court reporter had long since stopped typing, caught up in the significance of the moment. Even the bailiff, who typically maintained a stern expression, looked impressed. The morning sun now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating Sarah's face as she continued to speak with quiet passion about her work. We have patients waiting for these trials, she added softly. Every day matters. That's why I was in such a hurry that evening. We had just received crucial data that needed immediate analysis. Judge Andrews removed his glasses again, cleaning them with his handkerchief, a nervous gesture he rarely displayed in court. His mind wandered to his own daughter, who had struggled to be taken seriously in her corporate job. How many times had she faced similar prejudices? How many times had he himself contributed to such biases from this very bench? Your Honor, Sarah continued, I understand that my speed violation deserves consequences, regardless of my profession or circumstances. I'm prepared to accept whatever fine you deem appropriate. The simple dignity of her statement hung in the air, making the judge's earlier condescension seem even more glaring. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged knowing looks. They had witnessed countless cases of judicial bias, but rarely had they seen it exposed so effectively. A law clerk entered quietly with a stack of files, then froze as she sensed the unusual atmosphere in the courtroom. She had never seen Judge Andrews look so humbled, so lost in thought. The usual brisk efficiency of courtroom 3B had been replaced by something more profound, a moment of genuine self-reflection. Judge Andrews straightened in his chair, visibly gathering himself. In his years on the bench, he had handed down thousands of judgments, but none had forced him to judge himself quite like this moment. The weight of his earlier words and assumptions pressed heavily on his conscience. Sarah stood patiently, her presence a silent challenge to every preconception that had filled the courtroom earlier that morning. The coffee stain on her sleeve, her casual clothes, her worn leather bag, everything that had once invited judgment now told a different story, one of dedication, brilliance, and unwavering commitment to saving lives. Rather than sit in silence with his discomfort, Judge Andrews made an unexpected decision. He stood up from his chair, something he rarely did during proceedings. The entire courtroom shifted nervously at this break in protocol, unsure of what would follow. "Dr. Bennett," he began, his voice carrying a new tone of genuine respect, "would you be willing to share more about your journey in the medical research field? I believe everyone in this courtroom could benefit from hearing your story." Sarah paused for a moment, considering the request. The simple traffic violation hearing had transformed into something far more significant. She glanced at her watch, thinking about her waiting laboratory, then made her decision. "I'd be happy to, Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and confident. "I grew up in a small apartment just 10 blocks from this courthouse. My mother worked 2 jobs to support us, but she always emphasized the importance of education." The courtroom listened intently as Sarah continued. "I spent my afternoons in the public library because we couldn't afford after-school programs. That's where I first discovered my love for science. The librarians would save medical journals for me, even though they were meant for the reference section." Judge Andrews had resumed his seat, but he leaned forward, genuinely engaged. The stern facade that usually dominated his courtroom had completely dissolved. Even the bailiff had moved closer, drawn in by Sarah's story. "I worked my way through college and graduate school," she explained, "often taking night shifts at the hospital to pay for my books. There were many people who suggested I should pursue something easier, something more suitable." She smiled slightly at the memory. "But I knew what I wanted to do." A young black girl sitting in the back of the courtroom, waiting with her mother for another case, had stopped playing with her tablet and was listening intently, her eyes wide with inspiration. "Today," Sarah continued, "I lead a team of brilliant scientists. We work long hours, often forgetting to eat or sleep when we're close to a breakthrough. That's why I was wearing these clothes in court today. We had an important experiment running, and changing clothes seemed less important than monitoring our results." The judge nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face, the coffee stain on her sleeve, her casual attire, her rushed entrance. Everything he had judged negatively now told a story of dedication and excellence. "But what I really want to emphasize, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice taking on a gentle but firm tone, "is that my story shouldn't be extraordinary. There are countless talented people who face unnecessary barriers and judgments based on their appearance or background." The morning sun had shifted again, now casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor. In one of these bright patches stood the young public defender, nodding slightly as Sarah spoke. He had seen too many clients judged unfairly before their stories could be heard. Judge Andrews removed his glasses once more, but this time it wasn't a nervous gesture. He seemed to be trying to see more clearly, in every sense of the phrase. "Dr. Bennett, I want to thank you for your candor. You've given us all something important to think about." He picked up his pen, making a note on his calendar. "I would like to invite you to speak at our upcoming judicial conference about implicit bias in the justice system. Your perspective would be invaluable." Sarah's voice remained steady as she responded, "I would be honored, Your Honor, but I hope my experience today can serve as more than just a cautionary tale. Perhaps it can be a starting point for real change in how we perceive and treat each other in all settings, not just courtrooms." The coffee stain on her sleeve caught the sunlight, no longer a mark of carelessness but a badge of dedication. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, aware they were witnessing something more significant than a simple traffic hearing. By the following morning, news of the incident in courtroom 3B had spread throughout the legal community like wildfire. A young law clerk who had witnessed the exchange had shared the story with a local journalist, careful to maintain professional discretion while highlighting the significance of what had transpired. The Marion County Gazette ran a front-page story titled, "A Moment of Truth in Traffic Court," carefully outlining how a routine traffic violation hearing had transformed into a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumption. The article didn't sensationalize the event, but instead focused on its implications for the justice system. "I've been practicing law for 20 years, said attorney James Martinez, who had been present in the courtroom that day. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one judge and one defendant. It was about all of us and the assumptions we carry." The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with discussions. Legal professionals gathered around coffee cups, sharing their own experiences with bias in the justice system. A group of public defenders sat at their usual corner table, talking about how they could use this incident to better advocate for their clients. "Did you hear what happened after?" a junior clerk asked her colleagues during lunch break. "Judge Andrews actually reduced the fine and apologized publicly. In 15 years, I've never seen him do that." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully, but more importantly, he's called for a review of his past sentencing patterns. The story reached the Marshall Institute for Biomedical Research, where Dr. Bennett's colleagues were both proud and concerned. They had grown accustomed to seeing their brilliant colleague face such prejudices, but this time felt different. The public nature of the incident had sparked important conversations within the scientific community as well. Dr. Lisa Chen, one of Sarah's research partners, spoke to her team during their morning meeting. "Sarah has always let her work speak for itself," she explained. "But maybe it's time we all spoke up more about the barriers that still exist in our field." Local community organizations began reaching out to both the courthouse and the Marshall Institute. The Urban League requested Dr. Bennett as a speaker for their youth program. The Bar Association scheduled a special session on implicit bias, using the incident as a case study. Judge Andrews, meanwhile, had spent hours in his chambers reviewing case files from the past year. The incident had forced him to question not just his behavior that day, but his entire approach to justice. His secretary noticed he was taking longer with each case, reading through details he might have previously skimmed. The judge has requested demographic data on all his rulings from the past 5 years, the court administrator told her staff. He wants to identify any patterns that might reveal unconscious bias. The request created extra work, but no one complained. They understood the importance. At the local law school, Professor Rachel Thompson adjusted her ethics curriculum to include a discussion of the incident. "This isn't just about racial bias," she told her students. "It's about how quick judgments can corrupt the very foundation of justice. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be seen for who they really are." The story continued to ripple outward. Other judges in the district began examining their own practices. The court clerk's office started collecting data on fine distributions across different demographics. The public defender's office received additional funding for bias training. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from legal journals and news outlets, but she maintained her focus on her research. The coffee-stained sweater from that day hung in her office, a reminder of how a moment of prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for change. In the courthouse hallways, people pointed out the door to courtroom 3B to visitors, sharing the story in hushed tones. "That's where it happened," they'd say. "That's where one woman's dignity changed the way we think about justice." The incident had become more than a story. It was becoming a catalyst for systemic change. 2 weeks after the incident, Judge Michael Andrews sat alone in his chambers, staring at the enrollment confirmation for an intensive bias training program. The prestigious Judicial Education Center had fast-tracked his application, recognizing the significance of having a senior judge voluntarily seek such training. On his desk lay a handwritten letter he had spent hours crafting. It was addressed to Dr. Sarah Bennett, containing not just an apology, but a request for guidance. The judge had never written such a letter before. His position had always kept him somewhat removed from personal connections with those who appeared in his courtroom. "Martha," he called to his assistant, "could you come in for a moment?" The elderly woman who had worked with him for 15 years entered, notepad ready. She noticed immediately that something was different about the judge's demeanor. His usual stern expression had softened, replaced by something that looked like vulnerability. "I'd like to make some changes to our courtroom procedures," he began, his voice thoughtful. "First, I want to implement a new policy. Before passing judgment in any case, I want a 5-minute pause to review my initial reactions and question my assumptions." Martha nodded, hiding her surprise at this unprecedented change. She had witnessed the judge's transformation over the past 2 weeks. How he had started arriving earlier to read case files more thoroughly, how he had begun greeting everyone who entered his courtroom with more warmth. "Also," he continued, "I've been thinking about Dr. Bennett's words about barriers and judgment. I want to start a mentorship program for young people interested in law, particularly those from underrepresented communities." He smiled slightly. "Perhaps we could partner with the Marshall Institute." The judge stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square below. He watched as people rushed up and down the steps, each carrying their own stories and struggles. How many of those stories had he failed to truly hear over the years? His daughter had called him the night after the incident, having read about it in the local paper. "Dad," she had said, her voice gentle but firm, "do you remember when I told you about the times I felt judged in my corporate job? This is your chance to be part of the change." The memory of that conversation prompted him to turn back to Martha. "One more thing," he said, pulling out a folder. "I've been reviewing my past rulings, particularly in traffic and minor offense cases. I've found some concerning patterns in my sentencing." Martha watched as the judge, known for his unwavering certainty, struggled to find the right words. "I've asked the court administrator to help me identify cases where my bias might have affected the outcome. We're going to review them all, starting with the past year." On his desk calendar, several upcoming speaking engagements were marked in red. He had accepted invitations to share his experience at judicial conferences and law schools. The judge who had once prided himself on maintaining professional distance was now willing to make himself vulnerable, to share his mistakes and learning journey. "Dr. Bennett's research team is working to save lives," he told Martha, his voice filled with newfound humility. "While we're not doing anything quite so dramatic here, we do have the power to change lives through fair and unbiased justice. I've just been reminded of that in a very powerful way." Martha noticed a small photograph the judge had recently added to his desk. It showed his young granddaughter in her science fair outfit, beaming with pride. Next to it lay the newspaper article about the courtroom incident, carefully preserved as a reminder. "You know, Martha," he said quietly, "in 30 years on the bench, I thought I had seen everything. But sometimes the most important lessons come when we least expect them, from people we wrongly assumed couldn't teach us anything." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the judge's chambers as he returned to his desk, picking up his pen to finish the letter to Dr. Bennett. His written words would acknowledge not just his mistake, but his commitment to ensure that his courtroom would become a place where justice truly was blind to appearance and assumption. 6 months after the memorable morning in courtroom 3B, Dr. Sarah Bennett stood at a podium in the main conference hall of the Marion County Courthouse. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, law students, and community leaders, all gathered for the first annual Judicial Fairness Summit. "Change," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "often comes from unexpected moments." She wore a crisp lab coat over her professional attire, no longer feeling the need to choose between her two worlds, scientist and advocate. What happened in that courtroom could have remained just another story of bias, but instead, it became a catalyst for transformation. In the front row, Judge Andrews sat with a notebook open, just as he had done for every speaker that day. His silver hair had the same distinguished look, but his demeanor had changed dramatically over the past months. The stern mask he once wore had been replaced by an expression of openness and genuine interest. The changes he had implemented in his courtroom had already shown remarkable results. The 5-minute reflection period before sentencing had become standard practice, not just in his courtroom but throughout the district. His mentorship program had paired 30 young people from underrepresented communities with legal professionals. "Our research at the Marshall Institute recently entered the final phase of clinical trials," Sarah continued, switching slides to show a graph of their results. "And while we work to save lives in the laboratory, I've witnessed another kind of life-saving work happening right here in our justice system." The statistics displayed behind her told a compelling story. Since the incident, the county had seen a 40% reduction in sentencing disparities across demographic groups. The court's new bias training program, developed with input from both legal experts and scientists like Sarah, had become a model for other jurisdictions. In the audience, the young girl who had witnessed the original incident sat with her mother, now wearing a junior science club t-shirt. She had joined one of the STEM outreach programs that had sprung up through the collaboration between the courthouse and the Marshall Institute. But perhaps the most significant change, Sarah said, gesturing to a slide showing the Marshall Institute's visitor log, is the weekly rotation of judges who now visit our research facility. They observe our work, understand our challenges, and take that understanding back to their courtrooms. Judge Andrews smiled, remembering his own first visit to the laboratory. He had stood in awe watching Sarah's team work, finally understanding the dedication behind the coffee stains and casual clothes he had once judged so harshly. Our cancer treatment trials have shown unprecedented success, Sarah announced, drawing gasps from the audience. But equally important is the success we've seen in treating something else, the cancer of prejudice that can corrupt our institutions and cloud our judgment. The presentation concluded with a photograph that captured the moment of change. Sarah standing in courtroom 3B, the morning sun streaming through the windows, dignity intact despite the prejudice she had faced. The image had become something of an icon, reproduced in legal textbooks and diversity training materials across the country. As Sarah stepped down from the podium, the applause was thunderous. Judge Andrews rose to shake her hand, no longer the man who had made assumptions based on appearance, but a humble student of fairness and justice. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice carrying in the quieting room, "you came to my courtroom to answer for a minor traffic violation. Instead, you taught us all an invaluable lesson about justice, dignity, and the danger of assumptions." Sarah smiled, thinking of the many young scientists and lawyers who would face fewer barriers because of what had transpired. The coffee-stained sweater from that morning had been framed and hung in the courthouse lobby, alongside a plaque that read, "Let justice see with the heart, not just the eyes." The story of the judge and the scientist had become more than a cautionary tale. It was now a blueprint for change, a reminder that transformation could begin in the most unexpected moments, when someone had the courage to stand tall and be seen for who they truly were.